I should have known better. That's what everyone says after surviving something horrific, right? But here's the truth. Sometimes knowing better doesn't mean jack shit when you're face to face with something that shouldn't exist. Something that turns your whole world upside down and makes you question everything you thought you knew about nature, about reality itself. My name is Lisa Martinez, and I'm going to tell you about what happened in the Ocala National Forest. Not the sanitized version the local papers printed, or the bullshit story the sheriff fed to the reporters about a rogue bear. The real story. The one that still wakes me up screaming in the middle of the night, drenched in cold sweat, thinking I can smell that putrid swamp rot stench. It started like most horror stories do, with a group of friends looking for adventure. There were 4 of us. Me, my boyfriend Jake, our friend Mark, who fancied himself some kind of survivalist, and Alyssa, a new addition to our circle who worked with Jake at his tech startup. We needed an escape from the fluorescent lights and endless Zoom calls of modern life. So when Mark suggested a camping trip in Ocala National Forest, it seemed perfect. I remember the drive-in, how the towering pines created shadows that danced across the windshield of Mark's lifted Jeep. The air grew thicker, heavier with humidity as we ventured deeper into the forest. Spanish moss hung from the trees like gray funeral shrouds, swaying in the hot Florida breeze.
You guys ever hear about the skunk ape?
Mark asked, his eyes gleaming in the rearview mirror. He always had a thing for cryptids and local legends.
They say it's like Bigfoot's swamp-dwelling cousin. Meaner, though, more territorial.
Jake laughed from the passenger seat.
Oh man, you've been watching too many Monster Quest reruns.
Actually,
Alyssa spoke up from beside me in the back seat, her voice unusually quiet.
my uncle used to work as a ranger out here. He quit after finding something strange.
She paused, fidgeting with the hem of her hiking shirt.
He never talked about it much, but he wouldn't go back into these woods, not even during the day.
I felt a chill despite the muggy heat. There was something in her tone that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. We found a clearing about 2 miles from the nearest marked trail. Mark insisted it was the perfect spot. Secluded enough to feel like true wilderness, but not so far that we couldn't hike out if needed. As we set up camp, I noticed how the forest seemed to close in around us, creating a natural amphitheater of sorts. The canopy above was so thick that only occasional shafts of sunlight penetrated, creating spotlight effects on the forest floor. That first afternoon was pleasant enough. We set up our tents, gathered firewood, and Mark showed off by starting a fire without matches. The sun began to set, painting the sky in bruised purples and deep oranges through the gaps in the trees. That's when we heard it. The first howl. It wasn't like anything I'd ever heard before. Not a wolf, not a coyote, not even a bear. It was deeper, more guttural, with an almost human quality that made my skin crawl. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, echoing through the trees. What the hell was that? I grabbed Jake's arm instinctively. Mark's face had lost some of its usual bravado.
Probably just a...
Another howl cut him off, closer this time. Much closer.
We should go.
Alyssa whispered, her eyes wide and scanning the darkening forest.
We should go, now!
But Mark shook his head.
It's already getting dark. We'd never find our way back to the trail. Besides, we've got weapons.
He patted the hunting knife on his belt, trying to sound confident.
Look, whatever it is, it won't come near the fire.
If I close my eyes, I can still see us sitting there around that campfire, telling ourselves everything was fine. 4 fools playing at being adventurers, completely unaware that we were being watched, studied, hunted. I remember the way the flames cast our shadows against the trees, creating giant, distorted versions of ourselves. But there was another shadow too, one that didn't belong to any of us. A massive, hulking shape that moved between the trees just beyond the firelight's reach. We tried to ignore it, tried to convince ourselves it was just our imaginations playing tricks. Mark broke out a bottle of whiskey, and we passed it around, letting the burning liquid calm our nerves. Jake told stupid jokes, Alyssa shared stories about her work, and I almost started to relax. Then we heard the scream. It came from the direction of our cars, a sound that started as human but twisted into something else. Something primal and filled with agony. We all froze. The bottle of whiskey forgotten in Mark's hand. That's it, I said. standing up. We need to... The sound of breaking branches interrupted me, followed by heavy footfalls that shook the ground. Something was coming toward our camp. Something big. The fire flickered as if caught in a sudden wind, and that's when the stench hit us. A horrific combination of rotting vegetation, decay, and something else. Something chemical and wrong. Mark grabbed his flashlight and stood up, his hand shaking as he pointed the beam toward the sounds. The light caught something moving between the trees, something tall, massive, and covered in dark matted fur. For a split second, I saw eyes reflecting the light, glowing like hot amber, filled with an intelligence that froze my blood. Then all hell broke loose. The thing that attacked our camp moved with impossible speed for its size. One moment, it was a shadow in the trees. The next, it was among us, sending our campfire scattering in a shower of sparks and embers. The sound it made... Christ, I'll never forget that sound. Like a tiger's roar mixed with a human scream, deep enough to vibrate in your chest. Mark didn't even have time to draw his knife. The creature grabbed him by the shoulders, massive hands ending in curved claws that sank into his flesh like he was made of butter. I saw his eyes go wide with terror, his mouth opening to scream. But then the beast yanked him backward into the darkness with such force that his feet left the ground. The sound of breaking bones echoed through the forest, followed by wet, terrible noises that made me gag.
Run!
Jake grabbed my arm, pulling me toward the trees. Alyssa was already moving, her blonde hair catching the last light of our scattered fire as she disappeared into the undergrowth. We ran blindly, branches whipping our faces, roots threatening to trip us with every step. Behind us, Mark's screams had turned to gurgling, then silence. But the silence was worse, because now we could hear it moving through the forest after us. The heavy footfalls seemed to come from everywhere at once, accompanied by that putrid stench that made my eyes water. We ran until our lungs burned, until the taste of copper filled our mouths. Jake still held my hand, pulling me along, but I could feel him tiring. Alyssa had vanished somewhere in the chaos, and the darkness was absolute now, the moon hidden behind thick clouds.
Wait,
Jake wheezed, pulling us behind a massive oak tree.
need to catch our breath.
I pressed my back against the rough bark, trying to control my breathing. The forest had gone deadly quiet. No insects, no frogs, no night birds. Everything that called these woods home knew there was a predator on the hunt.
What the fuck was that thing?
Jake whispered, his voice cracking.
Did you see its face? It looked almost...
Human. I finished for him. But wrong. Like something trying to look human and failing. A branch snapped somewhere to our left and we both froze. The stench rolled over us again, stronger this time, making my eyes water. I could hear it breathing. Deep, wet breaths that reminded me of a bull getting ready to charge. Jake squeezed my hand once, then whispered,
When I say go, run straight ahead. Don't stop, don't look back.
Jake, no.
I love you.
He pressed something into my hand, his phone.
Now go!
He burst from behind the tree, waving his arms and shouting.
Hey, over here, you ugly bastard!
I ran. God help me, I ran. Behind me, I heard Jake's footsteps heading in the opposite direction, heard the creature's thunderous pursuit. Then Jake screamed, a sound of pure terror that cut off abruptly. I ran until I couldn't breathe, until my legs gave out and I collapsed in a small clearing. The phone in my hand was useless. No signal this deep in the forest. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I realized I was surrounded by strange markings on the trees. Deep gouges in the bark, some fresh, others old and scarred over. And there was something else. Bones. Small animal skeletons arranged in bizarre patterns on the forest floor, like some twisted art installation.
Lisa?
A whisper from the darkness made me jump. Alyssa emerged from behind a tree, her face streaked with dirt and tears.
Oh, thank God. I heard Jake.
I shook my head, unable to speak. She understood, covering her mouth to stifle a sob.
We need to move.
She whispered.
It's marking its territory. These arrangements, it's not just killing for food, it's intelligent.
A howl split the night, closer than before. We could hear trees cracking as something massive moved through the forest, methodically searching, hunting.
There's an old ranger station,
Alyssa said, grabbing my arm.
My uncle told me about it. maybe 2 miles north. It might have a radio.
We moved as quietly as we could through the underbrush, using the stars to navigate when we could see them through the canopy. The creature seemed to be toying with us now, letting us hear it circle around, herding us like cattle. Every time we thought we'd lost it, that stench would roll over us again, or we'd hear its heavy breathing just beyond the trees. Then we found the cave. It wasn't natural. The entrance had been cleared, widened. Inside, illuminated by shafts of moonlight from holes in the ceiling, was a scene from a nightmare. Bones everywhere, but not scattered, arranged. Human skulls placed in concentric circles, long bones laid out in patterns that made my eyes hurt to look at them. In the center stood a crude altar made of stacked stones, topped with something that made bile rise in my throat. A fresh human head, Mark's head.
Oh God.
Alyssa whimpered.
It's not just territory marking. It's a ritual.
A deep rumbling growl echoed from the cave entrance. We turned to see it filling the opening completely, its massive frame blocking out the starlight. This was the first time I got a clear look at it, and my mind still struggles to process what I saw. It stood at least 8 feet tall, its body covered in thick black fur matted with mud and vegetation, but its face, that's what haunts me most. Not quite ape, not quite human, with a sloped forehead and protruding jaw filled with yellowed fangs. And those eyes, those terrible amber eyes, filled with an intelligence that had no place in a beast. It was time for the final chase to begin. The cave entrance exploded into chaos as Alyssa and I bolted in opposite directions. I heard her scream,
"Run!"
before the creature's massive form lunged forward. In that split second, I caught a glimpse of her face, determination mixed with terror, as she waved a flaming branch she'd snatched from our earlier campfire. The smell of smoke mingled with the creature's putrid stench as she whipped the burning wood through the air. My feet carried me through the undergrowth, branches slashing at my face and arms. The forest had become a maze of shadows and terror, each tree identical to the last in the pale moonlight. Behind me, I heard Alyssa's voice growing distant, leading the monster away. Her sacrifice tore at my heart, but survival instinct drove me forward. The ground beneath my feet changed from soft earth to harder packed soil. A trail. Ancient survival instincts screamed at me to stay off it, to keep to the concealing darkness of the deep woods. But my rational mind knew the ranger station had to be somewhere along this path. The moon emerged from behind the clouds, casting everything in a sickly silver light. That's when I saw it. A squat, dark building partially reclaimed by vegetation. The ranger station. Hope surged through my exhausted body, giving me a final burst of energy. The door hung crooked on rusted hinges, groaning as I shouldered it open. Stale air and decades of decay assaulted my nostrils, but anything was better than that monster's stench. My hands fumbled in the darkness until they found what I was looking for. An old radio setup on a dust-covered desk. To my amazement, when I flipped the switch, red lights flickered to life. Some kind of backup power system must have still been functioning. I grabbed the handset, pressed the talk button, and started speaking. Mayday, Mayday. If anyone can hear this, please respond. We're in Ocala National Forest, we need help. There's something out here, it's killed. A sound outside made me freeze. Heavy breathing, followed by the crunch of footsteps on dead leaves. That same oppressive stench began seeping through the station's broken windows. I ducked behind the desk, clapping a hand over my mouth to silence my own ragged breathing. Through a gap in the weathered boards, I watched in horror as it emerged from the tree line. Moonlight illuminated its massive form in terrible detail. The matted fur caked with fresh blood, those terrible amber eyes scanning the station. It moved with an unsettling grace, almost human-like in its deliberate stalking. The radio crackled to life.
This is Forest Service Dispatch. Please repeat your location.
The creature's head snapped toward the sound. Those intelligent eyes narrowed, and I saw something that still haunts me. Recognition. It understood what the radio meant. It knew help could be coming. With frightening speed, it smashed through the station's front wall like it was made of paper. I scrambled backward, but there was nowhere left to run. As it loomed over me, I saw fresh blood dripping from its claws. Alyssa's blood. I believed I was about to die. But then something unexpected happened. Multiple engines roared in the distance, accompanied by shouts and the distinct sound of hunting dogs. The search party I'd glimpsed earlier when we first arrived was finally closing in. The creature's head whipped toward the sounds. For a moment, it seemed to consider its options, those terrible amber eyes darting between me and the approaching noise. Then, with a guttural sound that might have been frustration, it turned and bounded into the forest, each massive stride shaking the ground. Minutes later, when the search party found me, I was still huddled in that corner, clutching the radio handset like a lifeline. They found no trace of Jake or Alyssa, and only scattered remains of poor Mark. The official report blamed a rogue bear, despite my protests, despite the evidence that no bear could have done what we saw. But I know the truth, and sometimes on dark nights when the wind blows just right, I swear I can still smell that distinctive stench. I know it's still out there, hunting in those deep woods, waiting for more foolish humans to wander into its territory. The sheriff says they found Alyssa's backpack 2 months later, 5 miles from where I was rescued. Inside was her journal, and on the last page, written in shaky handwriting, were these words:
It's not just an animal. It thinks, it plans, and it's learning.
I've moved far from Florida since then, built a new life in the concrete jungle of Chicago. But I know better now. I know that in some dark corners of the world, ancient things still hunt. Things that blur the line between beast and man, between predator and something far worse. And sometimes late at night, I dream of those amber eyes watching me through my window, that familiar stench seeping under my door. Because deep down, I know a terrible truth. It let me live. Not out of mercy, but as a warning to others. A message written in blood and terror. Stay out of its forest.
Thank you for listening to the story. This one was a bit shorter than most of my other stories. That was intentional. It was written to be a quick story, as over the time that I have been editing it and creating the narrations, I could focus on a family get-together among some other things. I also used the first-person point of view, and wanted to see how it would sound from a female voice. I think that I will keep to this voice you hear now for the remainder of the stories on this channel. It seems to work well. What did you think? Was the story good? Do you like having the other voices? What creature would you like to hear about next? The Wendigo, or maybe something else? Comment below, and before I go, I just want to say to the new subscribers, welcome to the fold.